say if people wanted to ask, that there are a couple of questions about the Celtic Indigenous. We can talk about that afterwards. But briefly, how do I say the word of Auntie Denise's book? Anadich is a word I have learned, which means one meaning, and I've been reading her book, and one of the meanings she gives to that concept is walking with the weight of history behind us. And I think there's something for me about the landscape in Scotland. We tell stories, folklore. A friend of mine, Doogie Strang, has just published a book called The Bone Cave, which tells the stories of the pre-Christian traditions built into the landscape in Scotland of the Cailleach, the old woman, the old wise woman. It's in our place names. We may not have the living continuous culture, but we have the living continuous creation and the landscape, and our stories are there, and I'm going to go home with a renewed vigour to read and listen to them. Now these are stories in my country of Scotland. There are stories in England too. There is indigeneity in all these places. There is indigeneity in Wales and in Ireland and in all parts of Europe. So I'd be cautious about the notion of Celtic spirituality. I'd be aware of cultural appropriation. We do that to our own culture in Scotland. The notion of what is Celtic can be heavily romanticised with the 18th and 19th century revivalism. Beware of cultural appropriation. If you want to go back to the Golden Age, the 4th to the 7th century, it's not that long ago, I realise, but it's quite long ago. Look at Ian Bradley, who's written a book called Following the Celtic Way. They weren't particularly into environmental awareness. They lived in the land, they jumped in the sea like the Egyptian priests, but they were more interested in things like penitence and prayerful life, in pilgrimage, in mission. So I wouldn't particularly go to the Celtic period to look for inspiration and connection with landscape. I know that sounds counterintuitive to some ears, but I think we should be aware of how our Celtic history has sometimes been rewritten. I would also remember, and I think this is something I read in Auntie Denise's book, about the notion, and this is something from my culture too, that we talk of the big book and the little book of life, and the big book of life is the whole of the creation, and the little book of life is the Bible. And I grew up with that concept in my culture, and I've heard it again here. So where did it come from? Was it a pre-Christian notion? I'm fairly certain it would have been. There is indigeneity everywhere, but we must take care of the asymmetry of justice. And I guess my last thing would be just to say that the equality that we're looking for when we talk about Indigenous cultures, we may need to be amplifying the voices of some, and particularly First Nations cultures, and then go back home for me and ask, what does it mean to be First Nation in my part of a little bit of the earth in this world? What does it mean for all of us? Where's your indigeneity? But if you want to carry on the conversation, I'll be around.
Thank you. Reverend Ruth.